always operating from maps and models. It would be very rare for you to operate from the territory itself. So you might have familiarity with this idea of mindfulness. Mindfulness, this is my interpretation. Mindfulness is encouraging us to do with fewer maps and models when possible. And there's a benefit in this, but we have to use it intelligently, okay, skillfully. But even if you're extremely mindful, in order for you to be functional, you're still working from some kind of map or model. So mindfulness might allow us to start to, because mindfulness is more attention to the detail, more attention to what is, less reference to the map and model, more attention to what is. So that allows us to fill in some of the detail that otherwise would have been missing from our map and model. And that has benefits, but it cuts both ways, because when we're doing that, then it allows us to be more aware, but we're going to be, in some ways, it's going to compromise the level of efficiency. Now here, it depends on, there's a reason why we might find that our map or model is not as efficient as we want it to be. And so we can use mindfulness in order to gather more information so that then we can develop a new map or model that will allow us to be more efficient in our desired outcome. But in that process of focusing attention on the detail, on the territory, on what is, we're going to be compromising our efficiency in terms of achieving a particular outcome. So we just want to keep this in mind, that we want to have this full range of capacity. We don't want to cut ourselves off from any of it. We want to be able to use our maps and models because they help us to achieve our goals, because we have unfulfilled desires. We want to fulfill those desires. Using maps and models efficiently, intelligently, allows us to do that. It's part of what it is to have the human experience. We don't want to cut ourselves off from that. We want to continue to have that capacity. In fact, we want to expand that capacity. We want to be able to use all of our capacities and functions fully. And at the same time, we want to recognize the limitations of the maps and models so that we don't run into trouble. Now, as I say, we're always working with maps and models. So even when we're filling in more detail, we're still working with maps and models. It would be extraordinarily rare that you would not be working with a map or model. In fact, I will suggest that the only time you're not working with a map or model is when you are in a state of a transcendent state of oneness. And even though there is a possibility, so there's something called sahaja samadhi, which is when one is in a state of oneness and still functioning in the world, but there's nobody functioning. There's nobody there. There's only oneness, but there's the appearance of functioning. So there's no longer any individual there. So this is like Ramana Maharshi. This is, when asked, Ramana Maharshi reported that this was the experience, was sahaja samadhi. So that is a possibility. But for the rest of us, for the majority of us, what we're going to be dealing with is maps and models most of the time. So we want to start to have an understanding of the maps and models, and we want to work with them intelligently. Now, think about what a map or a model is. It's something that exists in your mind. It's a representation, and you perceive it. So think of chair. And notice how you are aware of chair. I'm not talking about a specific chair. I'm talking about the model of chair that you have. How are you aware of that? So for most people, it will be, most likely for most people, it will be predominantly visual. There may be some felt or kinesthetic component. Most of us probably process chair primarily visual, but it could be for different people. There could be other aspects of that representation. Now, however you represent that, notice that you actually can have awareness of it. So it actually exists somewhere. That model actually exists somewhere. In order for you to have awareness, it exists somewhere. So you represent that somewhere. And this might be an odd idea if you've never explored this before, but if you have, it won't be that odd. So you can just notice that you actually have awareness of it because it exists somewhere. You've given it a location. So there's somewhere in your sense of space in which you experience this representation of chair. And if it's visual, you could actually notice what it is. Like, does it have legs? Does your chair have legs? If so, how many legs does it have? Now, your chair might not have legs, but if your chair does have legs, you can be aware of that. You can notice that your chair has legs. Does your chair have cushion or no? Right? You can just notice these things. There's no right or wrong answer. It's just to notice how you represent chair. And we're doing this with everything. So these are objects. You could do this with any object. So foods, right? Apple, orange, banana. You can recognize an orange if you know what an orange is, even though you've probably never seen that orange before. And if it was a, and then we could extend that into citrus, right? So then you could recognize any citrus, whether it's an orange or a grapefruit or a lemon or a lime or any variety of citrus, you could recognize it based on that model that you have. And then we do this with not just with physical objects, but with other abstractions as well, right? So we're doing this with everything. So our whole world, our whole reality, our whole experience is actually experienced through these maps and models. And these maps and models are experienced through the five senses. So have you ever experienced anything apart from this? And what I will suggest to you is that you have not, that your entire experience is maps and models in your mind that you experience through your five senses. Now, the implications of this are vast. Because what this means is that you have the ability to determine your experience entirely, 100%, nothing excluded. You don't usually realize that because you don't realize that you have the ability to control or change your maps and models. You think that the maps and models are some objective reality outside of yourself that you have no ability to change. You think that other people are happening outside of you. Now, they may or may not be happening outside of you, but the thing is, you're not experiencing those people outside of you. Even if they exist, what you're experiencing are your maps and models of those people. So think about it. Every person that you know, how do you know that you know that person? Because you have a model of them. That the person you think you know doesn't exist. Any more than you can't find if you look on Google Maps, look up anywhere on Google Maps, and then try to find exactly that in out there in the real world. You can't. It doesn't exist. Because what you have is a map. It's a representation. It's not the thing itself. Remember, the map leaves out detail out of necessity. So you might have the map it represents something, right? You could find something on the map, and then you could go to the location that it represents, and you could say, well, gee, it matches up pretty well. This map seems to be a pretty good representation. But the thing is, the map leaves out the detail, has to. Also, the map, by and large, is static. It's not dynamic. It's not a living thing. Whereas the reality is dynamic, it's living, it's not static. So you right now think of some person you know who's not in the same room as you, and you think you know that person, but how could you? That person the so-called objective person, the person out there, they're not in the room. You're not actually knowing that person, you're knowing your model of that person. You think you know the person, you just know a model of the person. So guess what? This is really good news, because if you have any problems with that person, you don't. You just have problems with your model of the person. Now, if you're thinking that you have to change the person in order to be okay, you're going to have a lot of problems, because you don't get to do that. But if you start to understand that all you need to do is change your model, suddenly things become a lot easier. Or at least, let's put it this way, they become manageable. Whereas trying to change things that you don't have access to and that you don't even know exist is pretty unmanageable. But most people spend their whole lives trying to do that. Think about that for a moment. Most people spend their whole lives trying to change things which they don't have access to, and by the way, they don't even know exist. And they make their entire okayness dependent upon those changes. It's all conditional, right? I'll be okay when these external things that I don't have access to and that I don't even know exist change in the way that I think they should. And then you can start to understand why so many people are so unhappy, because they're trying to do something that doesn't, it's total fantasy. It doesn't exist at all. And the irony, I guess, is that people have it inverted, right? They would say that what I'm proposing is fantasy and that they're living in the real world. Whereas in fact, there's no evidence whatsoever of the reality of what they call the real world. The only evidence that we have, the only reality we have, is that which we actually experience. And what we actually experience are maps and models